Our scripture today is going to be in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. Immediately he made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds, he being Jesus. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Have you ever been afraid? And I bet we have a whole range of fear in here. Things that we were scared for our life. Maybe we were just things that we were scared for tomorrow. Big things, small things. But fear comes from one thing, and that's a threat. Right? The perception of a threat. Now the threat might be something big, or it might be something small. It might be, just the fear of losing your job because everybody's getting laid off at work and you're worried about it. Or it might be fear that you're going to get hurt. So there's all kinds of grades of fear, so to speak. What makes the difference usually is the environment we're in. For example, if I am afraid that I'm going to lose my job, but I also have a winning lottery ticket in my hand, how long or how big is my fear going to be? It's not right, not going to be much. So the environment has a big impact on the perception of fear. So when we perceive there's a threat, we're afraid. So I want to share a story. I want you, as I share this story, to think about the environment. And we'll talk about some of the environment as I share this story. And it's a confession as well, because I participated in some illegal activity. So write it down. Here's what your pastor did. So when I was a kid, my dad lost his job. My mom didn't work. And we were looking for any way we could to make money to get by. We had an uncle that lived in the house, the other end, the original piece of property was like 20 acres and it was all subdivided. And I had an uncle and an aunt on every corner of that 20 acres, and then my grandmother and my uncle lived at one corner. So we had gotten to know my uncle, and he was good at repairing bikes. He had been a mechanic, actually, a motorcycle mechanic on a Iwo Jima in World War II. And so he was really good with that kind of stuff. And he had taught me how to take my bike apart and clean it up and put it all back together. Well, we got this idea after my dad had lost his job. Why don't we get some old bikes, strip them down, paint them, clean them up, put them back together and sell them. Now remember those, penny ads you could get, the little sheets, the little flyers, so we would list them in there. And this went really well, so that my mom and dad actually got involved. So now it's me, my brothers, my mom, my dad, and my uncle. Of course, it didn't take long before we had pulled all the bikes that we knew of out of every ditch that we were aware of, and we needed to come up with more old bikes. Well, back where I grew up, they used to have these county landfills that were open. They would literally just come in and dig a trench, and there was no supervision, no nothing. You just threw stuff in the trench, Occasionally they'd set it on fire, and then eventually they'd just cover it up, and then that was it. So we shopped them. We shopped for bike parts. And we found a lot of cool stuff in there. We found a lot of bike parts in there. Well, eventually we had raided all the ones we knew of thoroughly, and we had to start going a county over, and a county over, and a county over. And we went over to this one county. Oh man, we got there, we were so excited. There were piles of bike parts, like up over your head. We just couldn't believe it. So we got out and we started going through it, and this man comes, "Oh, get out of that stuff." I'm like, what? He's like, "Oh, can't take that stuff." I'm like, "But it's a county dump." And well, he has separated everything. The guy that ran it separated everything, and he had it fenced off with a gate. Well, I don't know all the conversation that happened between my mom, my dad, and my uncle. But there was a lot of complaining about the fact that that was gated. So the decision was made that we were going to go ahead in the night and go over said fence and go through the bike parks. And we did. So my mom was lookout. She stayed up in the van by the road. My dad stayed by the fence as well so that we could pass stuff over to him. And me and my brothers and my uncle went and started collecting stuff. I sure hope whoever was taking care of that is not listening to this sermon right now. So we went over and we started in the night pulling all this stuff out. We'd take it to my dad, and he, my uncle would throw it up over the fence, and it was an 8-foot chain link fence, and my dad would take it and put it in the van. Well, we did this quite a bit, and we were having to walk down past all these mounds of trash, and we would go over and go through the bike stuff, and as we were heading back, suddenly there was a mountain lion in front of us. It was on the top of a pile of trash. You can imagine how scared we were. It's dark, we can barely see it, and it's looking right at us. And we're not supposed to be there. So we don't have flashlights, because we didn't want to draw attention to the fact that we were there. And of course my uncle has now 3 little kids with him, and he immediately, of course, puts all 3 of us behind him and tells us not to run. And of course, what do we want to do? Run. So we stand there for a few, the cat's still just looking at us, sitting there looking at us. So my uncle starts stomping his feet at the cat and hollering at it to go away. And it just sits there. So finally, he says, "Stay behind me, we're going to try to go around it." And just as we moved, the cat crouched down like it was going to pounce. So of course we all moved back. Cat set up again, and we were really starting to freak out. We're hollering for my mom and dad, but they're just too far away. My uncle is now at the point where he's picking stuff up and throwing it at the cat, and it just sits there. But every time we go to move, it crouches down like it's going to pounce. I think we spent a good 30 minutes there. Finally to the point where we were thinking, if Mama and Daddy don't come get us, then we're just going to get caught in the morning and put the handcuffs on and go, because, we'd rather just go to jail than get eaten by the cat, by the mountain lion. So my uncle continues to throw stuff at it, and it's not moving, so he finally decides to throw something and hit it. And when he does, we realize that it was a piece of tin all along. All along, it was just a piece of tin. Now, I'm telling you though, it really, really looked like a mountain lion. I mean, even my uncle thought it looked like a mountain lion. And every time we moved, we were just changing the angle. But what in that environment made that threat seem so real? Yeah, we were doing something we weren't supposed to do. We were guilty. I can plead innocence, right? I was just a kid, though I did know we weren't supposed to be there. What else? It was dark. Yeah.
Your imagination.
Yeah, our imagination. If it had been daylight and there was a cat there, do you think it would have been as scary as the night? No, because we didn't know. Some of what we were scared of was the unknown. So the environment made it worse. I mean, we were already a little on edge and afraid when we got there because we weren't supposed to be there. It's dark. And then there's what we perceived as a real threat. Well, the reason I'm sharing this story is because there's a little more to the story of Jesus walking on the water than we realize. And part of that is that we need to understand the culture at the time. At that time, and actually all the way back through what we know of Hebrew history, water represented the place of evil. It represented where evil lurked. Remember in Genesis, we talked about chaos over the face of the waters? Because water represented that which was evil. So there's a real threat, right? When they get in that boat, their boats weren't very big, by the way, and they start out in the dark, across the evil waters, and what happens? A storm comes up. Now remember, a couple of them are fishermen. And what do they know about storms and small boats? Yeah, it's not a good combination. People die. So there's a real threat, and then there's a perceived threat. That being the evil waters. And it's dark. Most of us, a lot of us, if we think back through our stories of when we were afraid, a lot of the times it has to do when we couldn't see what was coming. So they're out on the waters. It's dark. It's storming. The waters are the place of all that is evil. And what do they see? A ghost. Now, when we read this, I think every one of us says, well, of course it was Jesus. But put ourselves in their shoes. And we realize why they thought it might be a ghost. I mean, it was bad enough they were out on the water, but then the storm whips up, meaning evil is attacking them, so to speak, and then suddenly there's a ghost. So they're being overwhelmed by things to be afraid of. Right? And in this, finally they do realize it's Jesus, and Peter, of course, is the one that says, Jesus, if it's really you, command me and I'll walk out there to you. And he starts. He does. He gets out of the boat and he starts walking across. But then he notices the waves, the evil again. And he gets scared and he starts to sink. But Jesus grabs him. As soon as he hollers for Jesus to grab him, he does. So I want to share with you how this story was used. We use this story a lot to talk about faith, how we need to have faith. And that is definitely an important part of this story. But how the early church viewed this story, what they thought the writing of the story was about, was actually the church going out into the world. And there's all this evil in the world. How many of us have set out to try to change something and evil just keeps happening? Bad things keep happening. We hear that the church is spreading in some places, but then we hear about terrible things happening in those places, and we wonder, are we making any difference? Are we doing anything? And this story was to help us understand that, yes, the church gets sent out into the evil of this world. And that evil is not going to just sit still and be placid and allow us to just sail smoothly through. It fights back. And when Peter tries to get one over it, he sees what's going on and it scares him. And the same thing happens in our lives as well. Not only in the life of the church, but in our personal lives, doesn't it? All this stuff going on around us, all these storms going on around us, and we become afraid. And we are scared to step out and go further. Because as soon as we take that step, it just feels like things get worse. We have to keep believing. We have to keep walking. We have to keep moving forward. Because if we don't, we sink. And who was there the whole time? Jesus was. Jesus was right there. And when Peter needed him, Jesus was right there. Folks, we walk out through some tough storms in life. We get out. Some of those storms are not our fault at all. Some of them we might have been slightly responsible for, right? We might have been the one that threw the first rock. But some of the storms are things that just come at us. And it so seems like, too, that when we try to follow God, when we try to draw closer to God, it seems like that's when evil really starts lapping at our feet, doesn't it? Things just start going wrong. We need to keep moving forward. We need to keep believing, keep trusting. The story is there to remind us that Jesus is right there. Right there. Right there in arm's reach. And if we call out, he's going to help us. But if we'll stay focused on Jesus, we can keep walking on top. We can keep walking on top of the water. We don't have to worry. It's only when we take our eyes off Jesus that we begin to sink. When we start looking at all the bad stuff and letting it rule, that we begin to sink. If we'll stay focused on God and believe and trust, then it'll be amazing what kind of storms we can walk through. So it's an interesting thought when we think about the fact that sometimes the church and us as people, we get sent out into tough waters. We get sent out to storms. You know, taking on the life of Christ does not mean that everything turns into lake, a placid lake. And actually, sometimes when we accept Christ into our heart, and Christ wants to make such a difference in the world, guess where he's got to send us? He's got to send us into the world. And there are going to be waves and wind and storms. And we just have to keep believing. Keep trusting. Step out and trust. And God will get us through. Amen.